So I was, as you mentioned, around 6, 7 years old, and I had essentially had a drowning. And so it was a place that I had frequented many times before with my parents out in the country. It was a swimming hole, an area prepared for swimming, and it was known to many of the families that lived in the countryside of that particular area. And so the people that generally went, you saw them over and over again. You became familiar with the faces, and I became comfortable and competent. Even though I didn't know how to swim, I was doggy paddling, and so I ended up biting off more than I could chew. There was a dock in the middle of the lake, and I was accustomed to jumping off one particular side of the dock that took me closer to the shore. And I had seen a little girl who was about my height and my age, and she was jumping off the deep end. And I compared myself to her, and I remember thinking, well, if she can do it, I can do it. And so I remember this being my first experience with comparison, and it didn't serve me very well. And so I ended up jumping off the deep side where she had jumped off. And I didn't estimate the distance between the bottom of the lake floor and the surface, and didn't take deep enough of a breath, and ultimately began the drowning process. And this lake, as I'd mentioned, was very small, and the portion that was dedicated to parking was very small, which meant that a lot of the cars had to double park. So whenever you would park, you would become acquainted to like what car you were behind or who was behind you. And you really was observant to who would be walking, when a family would pack up and leave and walk towards the parking lot, because you would recognize, oh, this person's parked behind me, I need to let them out. And the reason that I mention this is because I'm really trying to illuminate how small this place was, and how conscious you had to be of those around you, and that you became familiar with who was in your environment. And this particular subject will surface again in the end of this story. So I enter into the drowning process, and I entered into a state of unity consciousness, or what is explained as unity consciousness. I didn't understand it then. And I would even say that I believe that many people enter into a state of unity consciousness in the dying process. And I can say this with some level of confidence from watching other people explain their experiences of NDEs. And so I do recognize it's maybe a part of the process of dying. And this particular process was a very elongated process for me, even though time was moving quite fast, and I may have only have been underwater for a matter of 5 or 6 minutes, toggling between the bottom of the lake bed and the surface of the lake. But it felt for me underneath the water, time had changed and shifted. And I entered into an incredible experience where I started to take in my environment and fall in love with my environment, and even with the dying process. It was an experience where I had to choose to surrender to the dying process, and even acknowledge as a 6-year-old that I was dying. And in this experience, I was moving, my perspective was moving between that of the POV of the child that was under the water to above the water out of my body, where I was able to see my mom. And I was even able to feel her emotions as she started to become frantic, looking for me and recognizing that she couldn't find me. And I do believe that a mother and child's bond allows a mother to experience the knowledge or the knowing that her child is in trouble. Because even though she couldn't find me or see me, it was a matter of seconds that she went into a panic, and recognizing that I wasn't just out of sight, that I was in danger. So I'm underneath the water, and I'm observing all of the little feet around me that's kicking water, and I'm watching children swim by. And simultaneously, I'm trying to leverage and push myself from the bottom of the floor above the water, where I would hold my hand above the water and simultaneously try to scream for help and breathe, which doesn't work. And I eventually realized that after about 3 times of doing that. So I would push myself above the water until I could get enough air to breathe in, and then I would submerge. And this process went on, and eventually I surrendered to this process of dying and recognizing that I was dying, which meant that I wasn't pushing myself above the surface to grab air. And I was still shifting my arm above the water and waving, hoping that somebody would see my hand. And in this space, I started to move into what I refer to as oneness or unity consciousness. And it only occurred when I shifted into the surrendering process. And once I surrendered, I fell in love with the beauty that was around me. And I realized that there was nothing wrong with what was happening. And I wasn't attached to the experience of suffering in this moment. Fear had subsided from my body. And I was watching the sand, the fragments of sand being kicked from off the floor of the bed by all the children around me who were still playing as if nothing was happening underneath the water. And I remember watching the fragments lift up towards the top of the water where the sun was breaking the crest, and that these pieces of sand became illuminated like shards of glass that were reflecting fragments of light throughout the water. And I remember thinking how beautiful this world is and how beautiful life is. And there was a calm and a peace that came over me. And it was just seconds before that I was in survival mode, like trying to figure out, how am I going to live? How am I going to get out of this? Almost like an animal with its leg caught in a trap. And in this new space that I found myself in, this place of surrender, telepathically, I heard a voice. And the voice asked me, what would you like to do? And in other NDE podcasts and recently a documentary that I was on, the question is often asked, what did the voice sound like? Was it a male? Was it a female? And there was no gender. And the voice felt very familiar, as if I knew the person. And it was telepathic. And my response was, I remember holding, the primary person that I was interested in was my mother, and it wasn't myself. And so my response was, this would destroy her. She wouldn't understand. And it was within those seconds of saying it telepathically that I started to see a woman's body who was in a very old bathing suit. It looked like something from the 50s or 60s. It was white. And I remember watching the ends of her hair. She had a very long braid that hung down her back. In the end of the braid, single braid, her hair was moving across the water as she was swaying towards me. And within these seconds, still my POV is shifting very fast between under the water, in my own experience, and then above the water, observing my mother's experience and feeling her experience. So again, shifting below, shifting above, shifting below, shifting above. However, even though I was shifting above, I never saw the woman's face or above her waistline, her torso. And as I was observing this woman, her body slowly shifting towards me and the beauty of her braid in the water, all of a sudden I felt her lift me up. I'd still had my hand above the water waving, and I felt her lift and hoist me. And in this experience of now being removed out of the water, I still hadn't caught my breath. And I could see my mother the woman who saved me had her back towards my mother. And I could see my mother catching eye of me and then rushing across the water. And all of this was in slow movement and almost film-like, right? And this motion would again be something that would repeat itself in my life. But this motion occurred in this experience. And my mother ran over to me, and before she grabbed me, I could feel the air enter into my lungs. And it was incredibly painful. And now the POV of being above the water and being able to see from a different perspective outside of my body had shifted. Now I'm back in my body. And so being completely in my body with that first breath of air, now fear has come back into my body and that primal sensation of like wanting to live. And my mother scoops me up and rushes me to the blanket on the shore and, is helping me catch my breath and calm myself down and, is checking my signs, making sure my vitals, like to the best of her knowledge that, I'm all right. And after a period of time before, I've settled, I'm now no longer crying, I'm not in shock, we decide that it's time to leave. And we begin the process of looking for the woman to thank her. And so my mom's like, do you remember what the woman looked like? And so I describe the woman, and we're scanning this very small shore, and we don't see the woman. And I think I've mentioned there's anywhere between 7-10 families there, and we don't see the woman. And so my mother tells me to wait there, and she goes to each blanket and like, hey, have you seen a woman? She pulled my daughter out of the water, saved my daughter's life. We want to thank her. No, we haven't seen her. Well, my daughter described she looked like this. No, doesn't sound familiar at all. Well, has anyone left? Have you had to let anyone out? No, we haven't seen anyone leave. So every family that we went to, nobody saw this woman. Nobody recognized this woman. No one even saw the event of a child being rescued from the water. Neither the lifeguard, who sat on a perched chair above us all, saw anything. And it became a little bit of a joke from that point moving forward that I had a guardian angel. And so there had been many experiences that has happened afterwards that probably shouldn't be here. And I've always had this warm experience of feeling safe, even in these experiences. So there's a part of me that would like to believe that maybe I do have somewhat of an angel or a guide that has supported me.
Outside of the drowning, you've heard a voice communicate with you, you've seen this woman save you that nobody was able to recognize. What did you think happened?
That's such a good question. Because I really have to look back as the observer and reflect on the 6-year-old, the 7-year-old, and the 8-year-old. And when I was in that experience, I had just recognized that I had drowned, or I was in the process of drowning, and how quickly life can just move away from you, that you can lose grasp of it. I didn't really have a relationship to any form of knowledge at that time that would allow me to understand the experience deeply. But what I did take away from it was a sense of calm and peace around death. I remember my younger brother and sister, up for weeks on end grappling with the concept of death, especially, a few months later to maybe a year later, we had watched our uncle have a heart attack in front of us and die in my mother's arms. And I remember they really struggled with it. And I didn't. And I remember trying to talk to them at like 7 or 8 and trying to offer them peace. And I didn't fear death. In all honesty, it felt like home, going back home. And there was even a part of me as I became about 10, 11, 12 that had a level of resentment towards my mother because I felt that because of her, I stayed and I could have gone back home. And I remember having a knowing, having information. And that information was, when I came out of that experience, that I was here to have as many experiences as humanly possible. That I was here to experience as many different lives, is what I used to say. I want to live many different lives. And that I was here to study the human experience, and that I was here to acquire that information. And, I remember children being asked in school what they wanted to be. And I always had a new interest, so it always shifted and changed. But ultimately, I remember saying, I just want to have as many experiences. I want to be as many different people as possible. And there was this show that came out in my youth around that time called, I think, Quantum Leap. And I remember being fascinated by this because I wanted to figure out how I could do this, how I could have as many different lives in one life compacted. So I had this knowing and curiosity that I think spawned from that event because it wasn't a byproduct of my culture or my environment. And it was deeply ingrained in me.
And then I know that when you were 30 years old, you had another awakening. So what happened then?
So it was the time frame of this awakening happened actually in 2022, so a little bit older than 30. However, throughout my life, I've had a lot of mini shifts. I called them pivots, and they felt like little awakenings, which I feel like we all have these experiences. Some people call them epiphanies, pivots, shifts, experiences, awakenings, internal nudges. Mine always happened in nature. I was highly introspective and I like to isolate and to be alone. And so I would often spend time in nature, alone in the woods. And I would use that time as a way to connect to nature. For me, to be in the woods felt like more nurturing and loving than even that I got it from my mother. So it felt very maternal to be in that space. And I always felt bliss and a high sense of love. And they were small, like it was just feeling more seen than I'd ever felt feeling more connected than I had ever felt. Feeling not alone, always feeling like there was someone with me. You know, that feeling when you feel like someone's watching you. I always felt that, but it wasn't as though someone was watching me. It was someone's presence was with me. And I feel like that is actually a natural space for us when we're in nature and we are participating and connecting with Source. And for me, that feels like a very natural space to have this type of connection. And I would have these little shifts. And I did have one in my 30s in New York in a subway where the shift was much larger, where it actually affected my experience of reality. So that experience under the water where everything slowed and time changed and the way people moved changed occurred in a subway. And I was reading a book by James Redfield called The Celestine Prophecy, and I was actually reading the Experiential Guide, which I think is the third or fourth book of the sequence. And when I looked up from the book, within the text that I was reading, I had a major shift. And when I looked up from the book, I looked up and started looking at the faces of everyone around me in the subway car. And everyone was smiling and looking at me and was highly illuminated from the inside. Not light shining upon them, but light coming from inside of them. And time shifts, it changes. The way people move, the way you experience time is very different in this space. And this happened for just a few seconds. It was so quick, but it was quick enough for me to recognize the shift, the movement change, the illumination, and the smiling, as well as feeling a sense of love and bliss at a high level. And as quickly as it happened, as quickly as it stopped, and everything went back into a quicker motion. And the illumination stopped and the smiles were no longer there. And the love and the bliss went from a high level and just started to dissipate as though a balloon was just letting air out. And I remember thinking it was the book that did this. Like, this must be one hell of a book. This is a great read, right? So in my 40s, I don't want to say after, it's in the awakening, I had an egoic death. I had a spiritual awakening and an egoic death, which is incredibly painful. In this space, you literally detach from your ego. You forget who you are. Nothing that you loved, experienced, or even wanted to be a part of in your previous life makes sense in the new life. You're literally grieving the death of an old version of you. And you sit in this liminal space, not knowing who you are to become, not knowing your new identity, but knowing you're no longer this person. And that you don't even enjoy or want to participate in what this old version of you did. And in this process, you're also grieving the death of friends, partnerships, maybe marriages, even of your career. For me, it was my career, a marriage, and friendships. All of this collapsed within a 2-week period, and I had lost everything that I had built. And I thought all of these things were me. And so here I was in a space where I was being shown that I had egoically attached to superficiality that was not me, which was leading me down a path that was not in alignment with why I'm here. And in this space, probably about 8 months after the heart of it was really occurring, as I'm leaving the liminal space and starting to kind of move towards and understand things a little bit differently. I'm no longer in this space of confusion. I ended up having another one of these mystical events of oneness. But this one was significantly larger and lasted much longer and came with significant amount of information and knowledge, which I had not had before. I had not had, I guess, what they call downloads. I had not received this in this way before. I was crossing between British Columbia and the US. And I was at in a line waiting to cross the border. And it was quite backed up. And it was a summer day. My windows were down. And I decided as we were inching forward every 5, 6, 7 minutes, little by little, incrementally, that I would pull out my book and read it as I was just inching forward. And I was listening to music. And I ended up catching wind of another car's music that was playing very loud and kind of aggressive, what felt like angry music to me. And I couldn't tell where this car was coming from, but it kept interrupting my reading and interrupting the music I was listening to. And I didn't want to roll up my windows. So I'm looking around for this car so that I can judge them, right? And get an idea as to who the hell this person is. And eventually they make it up next to me and we're sitting side by side. And I look at them with this shitty, chauvinistic, judgmental look. And I roll up on my windows and I turn up, the music that I'm listening to. And I go back to reading. And after I finished the paragraph of what I'm reading, which is The Gene Keys by Richard Rudd, and I believe I was on the third gene key, and I lift up from the book and I'm like, started thinking to myself, wow, you really judged those people next to you. And I heard a voice outside of myself, very audibly, that said, Lelanea, don't judge them. They are you. And I looked into the car and I was studying the people, and they were very quiet and calm. They didn't match the music that they were listening to. They were introspective. They seemed really, in all honesty, like really beautiful human beings, like really beautiful souls. And I remember just staring and observing them and thinking to myself, I might even really like them. I bet I could hang out with these people. I bet they'd be really great to have a conversation with. And within that mindset, all of a sudden, time shifted again. Things slowed down as if you were underwater, moving underwater. And all of a sudden, illumination, things became illuminated from within. The tree tops started moving in this very slow motion. The wind was blowing, but the motion, the movement, the speed at which the leaves were blowing completely changed. And I remember my eyesight was then caught by two young boys throwing a football, because as you're moving through between British Columbia and the US, you're in a park. And so there's people barbecuing and playing. And I'm no longer observing these people in the car anymore. Now I'm observing these two boys playing football. And I remember feeling the laughter and the play in which they were experiencing. So now all of a sudden I'm doing something. At the time I didn't know it. I now recognize I'm merging. So I'm merging with these individuals. And I'm observing the movement of the leaves of the trees, and I'm recognizing that they're moving really slow. And then the boys are moving as they're running in this very slow motion, as if everything's happening underwater. And I remember thinking, like, this is so weird. And even questioning whether I accidentally ate like a cookie or something that was laced with something that would create some sort of hallucination. And I even thought, like, retraced my steps as to where I just came from. And I'm like, no, I haven't eaten anything. I haven't accessed anything. So why am I having this experience? And so I eventually just stopped thinking critically and surrendered to the experience. And the experience lasted. There's other podcasts where I go really in depth, and I even published a writing on it where I go really in depth to the whole experience. But it ended up lasting what felt like in real time might have been about 12 minutes. But for me, I felt like I was there for like 45 minutes to an hour. And in this space, I ultimately started just panning my environment and merging with every person that I encountered within my purview, within my POV, my sight. And I started to feel their emotions. I could feel their stories. I could feel their human experience. It was like empathy times 1,000. It was like being a highly sensitive person times 1,000. And it was as if there was no space between myself and them. And I became them. And I ended up moving the whole 180 degrees around me. And I'm merging with families. I'm merging predominantly with men who are fathers and husbands. And I'm feeling their pride for the love that they have for their family. And all of these individuals are highly illuminated from within. Everything around me is so bright. And it's not coming from outside of people, from the sun. It's coming from within. And I'm in a state of love and bliss that I've never experienced in all my life. I have felt tremors, ripples of this, but it is so high that I'm sobbing, I'm crying, and my face is drenched, my shirt is drenched, but in this space, I don't realize it. I actually didn't realize it until I came out of the experience. But I did recognize that I was in love. I was encompassed in love, drenched in love, pouring out love, experiencing love. Love was an energetic frequency that was all around me. It was a texture. It wasn't just a space. And as I'm panning 180 degrees and connecting with all these different individuals and receiving their stories and feeling their emotions, I start to see what looks like a thread of light that's moving between the trees, really tall grass, different ornamentals that are planted throughout the park, and through the people, and it's all coming back to me. And the experience is building. It's not just plateauing, it's building. The sensation, the emotions, the movement of the people are building. And as I start to see the thread, I start to hear information. And I even start to repeat it audibly out loud as if I'm trying to crystallize it, make it real in a way by saying it out loud and hearing myself speak it. And I hear myself saying back what I'm hearing, and what I'm hearing is, don't you remember, you are source, you're a fragment of source, you are source, we all are sources. All of these people are a mere version of you, they are you. And you can live many different lives in one by experiencing all these individuals, because you all came in and you all chose to have different lives. But when you say you all, it's you. So you, meaning I, and meaning you and the viewer and all of us, we've all decided to have a different experience so that this experience goes back to source. It's information. But we're all the same person. And so as I was merging with each person, I was getting to experience many different lives in one. And in that moment, I remembered who I was. And in that moment, I started laughing because I started to realize that I am source, remembering that it's source and that it came here with this decision and desire to have this experience. And it wasn't the type of remembering that happens when someone, I've used this analogy before, but if you have like Alzheimer's or amnesia and people around you are trying to get you to remember family members, right? And they're like, don't you remember? There's photos all around the house. This is your son or this is your brother. Don't you remember? And then you start to convince yourself like, oh yeah, actually that does make sense. I do see photos of this person all around my house. Your face does look familiar. Like, oh yeah, you start to like almost gaslight yourself into remembering. And then there's this moment where the veil of forgetting for the person with amnesia or Alzheimer's lifts for a brief moment in time, and all of a sudden it's a full-bodied experience of remembering. Oh yes, that is my son, that is my brother. Well, that's the experience that I was having. This veil of amnesia had completely been lifted. And in this state of heightened love and bliss and just surrendering to all that is, I had the memory. And I was able to observe that I was source, remembering that it was source. And as quickly as I had that information come to me, all of a sudden, it's just time. It was as if this field, this space that I was in just started to shrink. And you could feel it because now you're starting to come back into density. Time started to shift. It started to pick up and get really quick again. The illumination that was coming outside of everyone started to dim and shrink back in. Everything happened so quick. But it was a space of like going from 100 and just quickly moving back down to 0. And as soon as the leaves on the trees, the way the wind was blowing and the way people were moving, all of a sudden went back to what we would perceive as normal, is when I was out of it. And I was just in a state of shock. My eyes were probably huge. I'm completely wet, and I'm still feeling the ripples of the love and the bliss, but I'm left there going, what the hell just happened? What, like in a state of shock. And there's no one that I can ask. There's no one I can be like, did you see that? What the hell was that? I have my dog in the backseat of the car. That was the only person that, the only being that was with me. So I finally crossed through the border, and I spent the next, 3 hours between Vancouver and Seattle, literally talking out loud to myself, like, what the hell just happened? What was that? What was that experience? And then I recorded, quickly remembered to put the recorder on my phone, and I verbally recounted the experience in an audio note, just in case I was so fearful that I would forget it. And I was in such shock, and I was like, how, if I let time go by, I'm going to forget this experience, and I'm not going to be able to share it with anyone. And so I made an audio note.
I know that you are highly sensitive and that you feel everything so much. You also work with people that are highly sensitive. And in the interest of time, I wanted to keep this a bit short, but what are your takeaways? How do you manage being so sensible to everything going on and everyone around you?
So what I recognized for myself, I never would have considered myself a highly sensitive person in childhood or my teen years or even in my 20s and early 30s. I had constantly lived in environments and was raised in an environment where my nervous system was always in fight or flight. And when you're in that space, you become guarded. Regardless of how empathetic you are, how highly sensitive you are, there's a space where you feel you have to protect yourself. And for me in that space, which I call guarded up, is it's very hard for me to tap into my intuition because I'm so much on guard. I'm hyper vigilant. And I know this to be true for many of my clients because a lot of the work that we do means working with the nervous system to get the nervous system to recognize that it can enter into a state of calm, or changing your environment, which is keeping your nervous system triggered or activated. And so the nervous system is incredibly beautiful. It's like a timekeeper of trauma. And for me, in my awakening is when I started to recognize how deeply open and empathic I was, and that I had denied myself of that experience of being highly sensitive and highly empathic for so long because I was tethered to a fight or flight survival mode for so long. And what I recognized is that in my awakening, I'd actually subconsciously set myself up as if I knew this awakening was coming. And I was able to take 1 year off where I didn't work. And I was able to tend to my own healing. And in that space, I did a lot of deep work in nature, in some of the most beautiful woods of the Pacific Northwest, where I was able to enter into a place of nurturing, surrender, and calmness. And in that space where my nervous system was no longer activated and I was reprogramming it and working through my traumas that are essentially, feeding the nervous system, dictating the nervous system, and how quickly it becomes activated, I was able to come into a space where I was blown so open that I was what they refer to as clairsentient. I could stand near you and feel your emotions, what you were going through. I could walk past you and feel what you're experiencing, to the degree that it was really difficult in that space, in that duration, to even go to the grocery store. I had to prepare myself just to go to the grocery store. I had to wear earbuds. I had to listen to a particular type of music at a particular hertz to support me, because I was becoming so, everyone's emotions were so accessible. And I'm lucky that I was in the Pacific Northwest. There's a little less anger, a little less aggressiveness, and there's a little bit of a different consciousness there, where in Portland, Oregon, where people were very, I want to say, conscious of interrupting or approaching another person. There was a level of like trepidation or permission, like, excuse me, may I ask you a question? Or, may I get your advice on something? Like, there's a level of like honoring another person's space and where they're at. And I'm very lucky that I was in the Pacific Northwest for this part of my life. And so with the clients that I work with, many of them have been blocked from their intuition. Many of them have been blocked from their own heightened psychic abilities or gifts. They come in ebbs and flows, and they want them to be more consistent. They want to be able to honor them and delve into them. And so I work with many clients who are highly sensitive, empathic, and even have clairs or psychic abilities. And we work on conditioning the body and working through the traumas or the fragments of self that are essentially trapped in the nervous system so that the nervous system can relax and allow you to be really open in how you perceive and receive others who are around you, your spaces and your environments.
For anybody that wants to connect with you, how can they find you and your work?
So I did start a podcast not too long ago, and the intentions behind the podcast is a philanthropic endeavor. And so the idea is really about philanthropy. And, we're in a day and age where there's so many different coaches and guides, gurus, spiritual teachers, and there's a plethora of content out there. And we're still in an age where a lot of people have not anchored into discernment. And the podcast that I created is called Integrating Consciousness. It's on YouTube, Spotify, and also Apple Podcast. And I essentially sit down and have really deep conversations with a lot of guides, mystics, psychics, people who are coaches. And for the most part, the majority of the people that I interview offer free sessions, free books, free information, free products. That is to much of the foundation of the podcast is something that I request of them. And it's available to viewers. Viewers can access these free sessions. And it really is to support the everyday person in recognizing what modality works for me, what technique works for me, and also a large amount of content and information to support you if you want to remain solitary on your journey. So there's a community if you don't want to remain in solitude, and for those who do, that want to, be individualized on their journey of healing, processing, growing, and expanding, then the content and the information is very much available, as well as free apps, free workbooks. It's just a really beautiful place with a lot of beautiful people within the community coming together to be of service to the general public. So you can find me there. I highly recommend going to my website and subscribing to my newsletter. The newsletter is really what will constantly keep you up to date to what's available, what you can access, what is free for you. And it's a non-intrusive newsletter. And then there's also my Instagram, which is always showcasing some of the best reels and clips and information from really beautiful conversations with really beautiful human beings that are out there to support the collective and support the expansion of consciousness. So that's where you can find me.